The morning sun cast long shadows across the coral beaches of Okinawa as Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the bridge of USS Indianapolis, watching the largest Pacific fleet ever assembled prepare for what would become the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. It was March 31st, 1945, and the final assault on Japan's doorstep was about to begin. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. adjusted his field glasses, scanning the deceptively peaceful coastline of the Ryukyu Islands. Behind those emerald hills and ancient stone walls lay an enemy force of over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, led by the brilliant and ruthless Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. What Buckner couldn't see from his vantage point was the elaborate network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions that Ushijima had spent months constructing, a deadly maze designed to bleed the American forces white. The statistics were staggering. Over 548,000 Allied personnel would participate in Operation Iceberg, supported by more than 40 aircraft carriers and 1,800 aircraft. The invasion force dwarfed even the massive D-Day landings in Normandy. Yet for all their overwhelming numerical superiority, the Americans had no idea they were sailing toward the most costly battle in Pacific theater history. Captain Ernie Pyle, the beloved war correspondent who had covered conflicts from North Africa to the Philippines, secured his helmet as landing craft began their final approach to the beaches. He had seen combat in every major theater, but something about this operation felt different, more ominous. The Japanese had learned from their previous defeats at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Saipan. They would not waste lives in futile banzai charges. Instead, they would make every yard of Okinawan soil cost American blood. As referenced in historian William Manchester's detailed account in Goodbye Darkness, the Japanese strategy represented a fundamental shift in their defensive doctrine. Rather than attempting to repel the invasion at the waterline, they would allow the Americans to land unopposed, then systematically destroy them from prepared positions inland. The irony was not lost on many observers that this beautiful island, with its ancient Shuri castle and peaceful farming villages, would soon become a charnel house. Okinawan civilians, caught between two military juggernauts, had already begun fleeing to caves and hidden valleys, carrying their few precious possessions and hoping to survive the coming apocalypse. Radio operator Sergeant Frank Morrison crouched in his landing craft, checking his equipment one final time. Around him, Marines from the 1st and 6th Divisions prepared weapons and reviewed tactical maps, their faces betraying the nervous tension that precedes combat. Many were veterans of previous island campaigns, but others were fresh replacements who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Within hours, both groups would be indistinguishable in their shared baptism of fire. The Japanese defenders waited in their concealed positions like spiders in an elaborate web. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Ushijima's chief of staff and the tactical genius behind the island's defense, had calculated that every day they held out would cost the Americans roughly 3,000 casualties. His mathematics would prove grimly accurate. As the first wave of landing craft approached Love Day, the designated start of the invasion, few could imagine that 82 days later, when the guns finally fell silent, over 200,000 people would be dead or wounded. The Battle of Okinawa was about to begin, and it would forever change everyone who survived it. April 1st, 1945 dawned clear and calm as the first American boots hit Okinawan sand. The Marines of the 1st and 6th Divisions, alongside soldiers of the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, braced themselves for the hell that had characterized every previous Pacific landing. Instead, they found empty beaches and abandoned positions. Corporal Jimmy Davis of the 22nd Marines couldn't believe his luck as he advanced inland without firing a shot. "Where the hell are they?" he whispered to his squad leader, Sergeant Bill Murphy, as they moved through abandoned farm fields and deserted villages. The absence of resistance felt more unnerving than enemy fire would have been. Every Marine knew the Japanese were there, somewhere, waiting. The deception was masterful. While Allied forces secured beachheads and expanded their perimeter with almost suspicious ease, Lieutenant General Ushijima watched from his underground command post beneath Shuri Castle. His strategy was working perfectly. Let the Americans land. Let them bring their supplies, their vehicles, their confidence. Then crush them against the prepared defenses of the Shuri line. By the end of Love Day, over 60,000 Allied troops had landed with minimal casualties. General Buckner established his headquarters and began planning the advance toward the airfields at Yantan and Kadena. The rapid progress seemed to validate pre-invasion intelligence estimates that predicted the island would fall within weeks. How wrong they were. The first hint of what lay ahead came on April 4th, when the 7th Infantry Division encountered heavy resistance near the village of Kakazu. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez led his platoon up a seemingly innocent hillside, only to walk into a carefully prepared killing field. Japanese machine guns, mortars, and artillery opened fire from concealed positions carved deep into the coral rock. Martinez watched in horror as half his men fell within minutes. The survivors crawled behind whatever cover they could find while enemy fire poured down like deadly rain. "We're pinned down!" he radioed back to battalion headquarters, his voice barely audible over the constant crack of rifle fire. "They've got us zeroed in from multiple positions." This pattern repeated across the American front as units encountered the outer edge of the Shuri defensive system. What appeared to be simple hilltops were revealed as fortress complexes connected by tunnels and protected by interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese had turned Okinawa's natural terrain into a nearly impregnable defensive position. Colonel Yahara's defensive plan was working exactly as intended. Rather than meeting the Americans at the beaches where naval gunfire and air support could be most effective, he had drawn them inland where every advance would require costly frontal assaults against prepared positions. The coral limestone of Okinawa provided perfect material for constructing tunnels and caves that could withstand even direct hits from naval artillery. Private First Class Tommy Chen, a replacement who had arrived just weeks before the invasion, found himself in a nightmare beyond his worst imagination. His company had advanced barely 2 miles from the landing beaches when they encountered their first major defensive position. The hills seemed to come alive with gunfire. He would later write to his sister. Every rock could hide an enemy. Soldier, every cave mouth a machine gun nest. The weather added another dimension to the growing misery. Spring rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and coral dust. Wounded men drowned in shell craters filled with water. Supply lines became treacherous obstacle courses where every step might trigger a sniper's bullet or mortar round. As the first week of fighting drew to a close, American casualties began mounting at an alarming rate. The easy advance of Love Day seemed like a distant memory as units ground forward yard by bloody yard against fanatic resistance. General Buckner realized his forces had walked into the most sophisticated defensive network the Japanese had yet constructed in the Pacific. War. The real battle for Okinawa was just beginning. By mid-April, the illusion of easy victory had completely evaporated. American forces found themselves locked in a grinding battle of attrition against the most formidable defensive system they had yet encountered in the Pacific. The Shuri line stretched across the narrow waist of Okinawa like a steel barrier, anchored by ancient Shuri Castle and defended by fanatical Japanese troops who had vowed to die rather than surrender. Captain John Bradley of the 96th Infantry Division studied the terrain ahead through his binoculars, trying to identify enemy positions among the coral ridges and tomb-studded hillsides. Every fold in the ground could conceal a machine gun nest, every cave entrance a mortar position. His battalion had been attempting to capture a single hill for 3 days, suffering 50% casualties without advancing more than 100 yards. The Japanese defensive strategy, orchestrated by the brilliant Colonel Yahara, was devastatingly effective. Rather than manning fixed positions that could be destroyed by concentrated firepower, defenders would emerge from hidden tunnels to engage American troops, then disappear back underground before artillery could respond. It was warfare by invisible enemies who seemed to materialize from the earth itself. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison led the assault on what his men had dubbed Suicide Hill, a coral outcropping that commanded the approaches to Shuri. His Marines had taken the position twice, only to be driven off by counterattacks that seemed to come from nowhere. "They're like ghosts," Morrison reported to his regimental commander. "We clear a position, move forward, and suddenly there are Japanese. Behind us again." The tunnels beneath Okinawa formed an underground city where thousands of defenders could move unseen between positions. Some tunnel systems extended for miles, connecting defensive strong points and allowing rapid reinforcement of threatened areas. American flamethrower teams would seal cave entrances, only to discover that the defenders had escaped through alternate exits hundreds of yards away. Sergeant William O'Brien of the 1st Marine Division experienced the horror firsthand when his squad was ambushed while advancing through what appeared to be abandoned ruins. "The ground just exploded with enemy fire," he later recalled. "Japs popping up from spider holes, machine guns opening up from positions we'd passed an hour earlier. It was like fighting an enemy that could walk through walls." The weather turned from bad to worse as the April rains intensified, transforming the battlefield into a nightmarish landscape of mud, flooded craters, and decomposing bodies. According to journalist Robert Sherrod's dispatches, published in Time magazine during the campaign, the conditions exceeded even those experienced during the brutal fighting at Tarawa and Iwo Jima. Medical corpsmen, like Hospital Corpsman 2nd, Class David Kim, faced impossible challenges in evacuating wounded men from forward positions. Enemy snipers specifically targeted medical personnel, forcing corpsmen to crawl through coral rubble and mud under constant fire. Kim would make 17 trips to rescue wounded Marines from a single engagement, earning him the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. The Japanese defenders were equally suffering, though their sacrificial mentality prevented surrender even when positions became untenable. Major Yoshitaka Higa commanded a battalion defending one of the key hills in the Shuri complex. His men had been without regular food supplies for over a week, reduced to eating grass and drinking rainwater collected in helmets. Yet they continued, fighting with desperate intensity. General Ushijima maintained tight control over his forces from his underground headquarters, rotating units between positions and carefully husbanding his reserves for the critical moments when American breakthroughs threatened the entire defensive line. His staff estimated they were inflicting casualties at a ratio of nearly 3-to-1, exactly what Japanese high command needed to make the cost of invading Japan itself seem prohibitive to American planners. As April drew to a close, both sides were locked in a death grip that showed no signs of loosening. The Americans possessed overwhelming firepower and endless supplies, but the Japanese held terrain that seemed almost impregnable. Every hill captured came at a terrible cost, and there were dozens more hills ahead, each one more heavily fortified than the last. The battle for Okinawa had become exactly what Colonel Yahara had intended, a prolonged bloodletting that would demonstrate to the Americans the horrific cost of invading the Japanese home islands. While American ground forces bled, against the Shuri line, a new dimension of horror descended from the skies above Okinawa. The Japanese unleashed the largest kamikaze campaign in history, sending wave after wave of suicide pilots against the massive Allied naval force supporting the invasion. Operation Tengo, as the Japanese called it, would sink or damage hundreds of American vessels and create a reign of terror that haunted sailors for the rest of their lives. Seaman First Class Robert Patterson stood at his battle station aboard the destroyer USS Laffey on April 16th when the first massive kamikaze attack began. The morning had started peacefully enough, with the ship providing fire support for Marines advancing on the Shuri positions. Then radar operators began reporting massive formations of enemy aircraft approaching from the north, over 350 planes in the largest single kamikaze attack of the war. General quarters! General quarters! All hands man your battle stations! The alarm bell echoed through the ship as sailors raced to their positions. Patterson watched in fascination and terror as the sky filled with enemy aircraft. Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Betty medium bombers, all loaded with explosives and piloted by men who had already written their death poems. The kamikaze. Pilots came in waves seemingly indifferent to the wall of anti-aircraft fire that rose to meet them. 20-year-old Lieutenant Yukio Araki guided his Zero through the deadly barrage, his aircraft shuddering under hits from multiple guns. His mission was simple: die gloriously for the Emperor while taking as many Americans with him as possible. The mathematics of the exchange favored Japan, one pilot and one aircraft against an entire warship and its crew. Captain Frederick Beckton commanded the Laffey as she became the focus of concentrated kamikaze attacks. 22 enemy aircraft targeted his single destroyer in an 80-minute period that would become legendary in naval history. "They kept coming and coming," Beckton later wrote in his memoir. "As soon as we'd splash one, 2 more would appear. Through the smoke. It was like trying to fight off a swarm of angry hornets." The destroyer's gunners, led by Chief Petty Officer James Johnson, fought their weapons until the barrels glowed red-hot. Johnson watched one kamikaze approach through his gun sight, the pilot's face clearly visible in the aircraft's canopy. "You could see he was just a kid," Johnson remembered. "Couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, but he was coming to kill us, and we had to kill him first." 5 kamikazes struck the Laffey directly, and she absorbed hits from countless others, yet somehow remained afloat. Her survival became one of the epic stories of the Pacific War, a testament to both American damage control techniques and the incredible bravery of her crew. 32 sailors died and 71 were wounded, but the ship lived. The kamikaze campaign's psychological impact often exceeded its material damage. Sailors who had faced conventional air attacks found the deliberate, methodical approach of suicide pilots far more unnerving than random bombing runs. Hospital Corpsman, 3rd Class. Michael Rodriguez served aboard the hospital ship USS Comfort when she was struck by a kamikaze on April 28th, a violation of international law that shocked even hardened combat veterans. "We were clearly marked as a hospital ship," Rodriguez recalled. "Red crosses painted everywhere, fully illuminated at night. But that pilot came straight for us anyway. 29 people died, including 6 nurses. It was murder, pure and simple." According to wartime reporting by Associated Press correspondent Hal Boyle, who witnessed multiple kamikaze attacks while aboard various Navy vessels, the suicide campaign represented a new level of warfare that challenged Western understanding of military logic and human nature. The kamikaze threat forced Admiral Nimitz to maintain an enormous fleet of over 1,500 vessels around Okinawa, far larger than originally planned. Fighter patrols flew constantly, radar picket destroyers formed defensive screens far from the main force, and every ship maintained maximum alert status around the clock. The strain on crews was enormous. Men slept at their battle stations for weeks at a time. By the end of April, the kamikaze attacks had sunk or damaged over 200 American vessels, killed thousands of sailors, and demonstrated that the whole Japanese were prepared to sacrifice their entire air force in defense of their homeland. The attacks would continue throughout the Okinawa campaign, adding an additional layer of horror to what was already the bloodiest Pacific battle of the war. As May began, both the naval forces offshore and ground forces ashore faced the grim reality that the Japanese would fight to the absolute end, accepting no compromise and seeking no quarter in their desperate defense of the last stepping stone to Japan itself. The month of May 1945 brought a new phase of brutality to the Okinawa campaign as American forces finally began penetrating the outer defenses of the Shuri Line. What followed was close-quarters combat of unprecedented savagery, fought cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel, in conditions that reduced grown men to primal survival instincts. Private First Class. Eugene Sledge of the 1st Marine Division found himself in the heart of this hellish landscape, advancing with his mortar team toward the ancient village of Wana. The area had been transformed into a fortress of interconnected caves and firing positions, each one requiring individual assault by flamethrower teams and demolition engineers. The stench was overwhelming, Sledge later wrote in his memoir. Death was everywhere, in the mud, in the caves, hanging in the air like a physical presence. The breakthrough came when American forces discovered a weakness in the Japanese defensive system near the village of Maeda. Staff Sergeant Harold Russell led his engineer platoon in a desperate assault up a coral escarpment that his men nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. Under constant fire from multiple positions, Russell's team established the first permanent foothold behind the main defensive line, opening a gap that larger forces could exploit. The fighting at Hacksaw Ridge became legendary for its intensity and heroism. Hospital Corpsman First Class. Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who refused to carry weapons, single-handedly rescued 75 wounded soldiers from the deadly ridgetop, lowering them to safety with improvised rope systems while enemy fire erupted around him. His extraordinary courage under fire earned him the Medal of Honor and demonstrated that heroism took many forms in the crucible of Okinawa. Colonel Yahara recognized the threat posed by the American penetration and ordered immediate counterattacks to seal the breach. Japanese soldiers launched desperate night assaults, often fighting hand-to-hand with American troops in the darkness. Second Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell of the 77th Infantry Division found himself in close combat, with a Japanese officer wielding a samurai sword, both men struggling in the mud and coral dust for possession of a strategic cave entrance. It was like something out of medieval times, Mitchell reported. 2 men with bladed weapons fighting to the death over a hole in the ground. But that hole commanded the approaches to 3 other positions, so it was worth dying for. The American advance was measured in yards per day, with each position requiring careful coordination between infantry, engineers, flamethrower teams, and artillery. Tank infantry teams developed new tactics for cave fighting, with Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers providing close support, while infantry sealed tunnel entrances with explosives and poison gas. As referenced in official U.S. Army historical records compiled immediately after the war, the fighting during this period reached levels of intensity that shocked even veteran commanders who had witnessed previous Pacific campaigns. The weather continued to plague both sides as the spring rains intensified. Battlefield conditions deteriorated, to the point where wounded men drowned in flooded shell craters and supply lines became nearly impassable quagmires. Sergeant Major William Hayes of the 6th Marine Division watched his supply convoy struggle for 6 hours to advance half a mile, with vehicles constantly bogging down in coral mud that had the consistency of concrete. Japanese resistance began, showing signs of strain as ammunition and food supplies dwindled. Major Higa's battalion, still defending positions near Shuri Castle, had been reduced to eating tree bark and drinking polluted water from shell craters. Yet discipline remained tight, and the defenders continued fighting with the same fanatical determination that had characterized the entire campaign. General Buckner faced increasing pressure from higher command to accelerate the advance. The prolonged battle was consuming resources needed for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Casualties were approaching levels that threatened to impact future operations, yet the Japanese showed no signs of weakening resolve. The breakthrough, when it finally came, resulted from a combination of American persistence and Japanese exhaustion. On May 18th, patrols from the 1st Marine Division discovered that several key positions in the Shuri complex had been abandoned during the night. Colonel Yahara had made the difficult decision to withdraw his forces to a new defensive line in the south, trading space for time in the hope of prolonging the battle even further. American forces poured through the gaps in the crumbling Shuri line, finally capturing the ancient castle that had anchored Japanese defenses for over a month. But their victory was incomplete. Most of the Japanese garrison had escaped to fight again from new positions, and the bloodiest phase of the battle was yet to come. The fall of Shuri Castle on May 21st marked not the end of Japanese resistance, but rather its transformation into something even more desperate and deadly. Lieutenant General Ushijima had skillfully withdrawn the remnants of his forces to the rugged Kiamu Peninsula in the south of Okinawa, where they would make their final stand in terrain even more forbidding than the Shuri line. Captain Robert Craig of the 6th Marine Division stood at the edge of the Oroku Peninsula, studying the maze of coral ridges, deep ravines, and hidden caves that stretched before his weary company. After 6 weeks of continuous combat, his men were hollow-eyed ghosts of their former selves, but the Japanese defenders ahead of them were equally exhausted and far more desperate. The Southern campaign differed from the earlier fighting in its sheer hopelessness. Japanese commanders knew they could no longer hold their positions indefinitely, but they were determined to extract the maximum cost in American blood before their inevitable destruction. Every cave became a potential tomb, every ridge a killing ground where wounded Japanese soldiers detonated grenades rather than surrender. Sergeant First Class Anthony Ricci led his squad through the village of Itamen, now a landscape of rubble, and death, where civilians had been caught between the opposing forces. The worst part wasn't the enemy fire, Ricci later recalled. It was the civilians. Old men, women, children, all dead or dying in the ruins. The Japs had told them we'd torture and kill them. So many committed suicide rather than be captured. Whole families found dead in caves, parents clutching their children. The tragedy of Okinawan civilians reached its peak during this final phase of the campaign. Caught between Japanese troops who viewed surrender as dishonor and American forces who couldn't distinguish combatants from non-combatants in the chaos of battle, thousands of innocent islanders died in circumstances that haunted survivors on both sides for decades. Lieutenant General Ushijima established his final command post in a cave complex near Hill 89, where he and Colonel Yahara continued directing the defense with the same tactical brilliance they had demonstrated throughout the campaign. Both men knew death was inevitable, but they were determined to fulfill their duty to the Emperor by making the American victory as costly as possible. The fighting reached new levels of savagery as trapped Japanese units launched increasingly desperate counterattacks. On the night of May 24th, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers participated in a final banzai charge near the village of Yuki, emerging from caves and hidden positions in a massive suicide assault that achieved nothing except their own destruction. Corporal Eddie Murphy of the 7th Infantry Division found himself in the path of this human avalanche, watching in horror and fascination as waves of Japanese soldiers charged directly into American machine gun fire. They came screaming out of the darkness with bayonets fixed, samurai swords flashing in the muzzle flashes. It was like something out of a nightmare, men running toward certain death because their code of honor demanded it. The American response was equally brutal. Flamethrower teams systematically sealed cave entrances, often trapping entire groups of defenders inside. Artillery and naval gunfire pulverized suspected positions without regard for civilian casualties. The civilized rules of warfare had broken down completely in the face of such prolonged and bitter fighting. As June began, American forces controlled most of southern Okinawa, but Japanese resistance continued from an ever-shrinking network of caves and fortified positions. General Buckner pushed his exhausted divisions forward, knowing that every day of delay meant more casualties from enemy fire and disease. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Frank Martinez worked continuously in field aid stations that resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno. We were treating everything: combat exhaustion, dysentery, infected wounds, men who'd simply reached the breaking point. Both sides were falling apart, but nobody would quit. The final Japanese positions clustered around the cliffs of Kiamu Peninsula, where Ushijima and his staff prepared for the ritual suicide that military honor demanded. They had fought brilliantly and extracted a terrible price for American victory, but the outcome had never been in doubt. Japan's strategy of making invasion too costly to contemplate was succeeding, though at the cost of an entire army. As American forces closed in on the last defensive positions, both sides knew the end was near. The question was not whether the Japanese would be defeated, but whether anyone would survive to remember the lessons learned in this charnel house of coral and blood. June 18, 1945, began like any other day in the hellish landscape of southern Okinawa, but it would end with tragedy that symbolized the entire campaign's brutal cost. General Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, moved forward to observe the final assaults against Japanese positions when an enemy artillery shell struck his observation post. The man who had led American forces through their costliest Pacific. Victory died just days before its conclusion, becoming one of the last casualties in a battle that had already consumed far too many lives. The death of General Buckner stunned American forces who had followed him through 3 months of unrelenting combat. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, now commanding what remained of his Marine battalion, received the news while preparing for what everyone hoped would be the final assault. It seemed impossible that the old man could die so close to the end. Morrison later wrote, "We'd all survived so much, lost so many friends. It felt like a cruel joke played by fate itself." The Japanese defenders were equally nearing their end. Lieutenant General Ushijima and Colonel Yahara performed ritual seppuku in their clifftop cave on June 22nd, choosing death over the dishonor of surrender. Their final radio message to Tokyo simply stated, "Our strategy, tactics, and techniques were all used to the utmost. We fought valiantly, but it was not enough." With their deaths, organized Japanese resistance finally ceased after 82 days of continuous battle. Sergeant Eugene Sledge walked through the now silent battlefield, trying to comprehend the scale of destruction surrounding him. "The entire southern end of Okinawa looked like the surface of the moon," he observed. "Every tree was splintered, every building destroyed. The coral had been churned into powder by constant shelling. It was hard to believe anything could ever grow here. Again." The final casualty count staggered even hardened military statisticians. American forces had suffered over 49,000 casualties, including 12,300 dead, more than any other Pacific campaign. Japanese losses exceeded 110,000 killed, with only a few hundred prisoners taken. Most shocking of all, civilian casualties numbered over 150,000, representing nearly 1/3 of Okinawa's entire population. Captain John Bradley, one of the few surviving company commanders from the 96th Infantry Division, attempted to process these numbers while writing letters to the families of men who had served under him. How do you explain to a mother that her son died for a coral hill that nobody outside the military will ever remember? How do you tell her that his sacrifice was necessary for victory when the victory feels so hollow? The campaign's impact extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. According to classified post-war analyses referenced in military historical archives, the casualties suffered at Okinawa directly influenced American decision-making regarding the invasion of Japan itself. Plans for Operation Downfall projected over 1 million American casualties based on the Okinawa experience, estimates that helped justify the decision to use atomic weapons rather than continue conventional warfare. Hospital corpsman David Kim, who had survived the entire campaign, walked through the military cemeteries that now dotted the island. Row after row of white crosses and stars of David, each one representing someone's brother, son, husband, father. The Japanese had their own cemetery on the other side of the island. Just as many graves, just as much grief. For the surviving Okinawan civilians, the end of fighting brought new challenges. Their island lay in ruins, their communities destroyed, their traditional way of life shattered beyond recognition. Many had lost entire families and faced an uncertain future under American occupation. The battle that was supposed to be their liberation had become their catastrophe. The veterans who survived Okinawa carried its memories for the rest of their lives. Unlike previous Pacific campaigns that had clear objectives and decisive victories, Okinawa felt different, more like a grinding war of attrition that nobody truly won. The psychological casualties would continue long after the physical wounds healed. As American forces prepared to leave the island for the planned invasion of Japan, few realized that Okinawa would be their last major Pacific battle. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August would end the war without the massive casualties everyone expected. In that sense, the men who died on Okinawa had purchased peace with their blood, though they would never know it. The Battle of Okinawa stands as testament to the ultimate cost of total war, a reminder that victory can be so expensive that it raises questions about the very nature of winning and losing. In the coral caves and muddy ridges of this small Pacific island, both sides learned that some battles are too terrible to fight, even when they must be fought. The legacy of those 82 days would influence military thinking and international relations for generations to come, ensuring that the men who died there were not forgotten, even if the lessons they taught were sometimes ignored.